The storm hit the Wyoming mountains like a hammer, sealing every cabin and road under sheets of ice. But in the middle of that deadly whiteout, a German shepherd named Ranger burst into Jack Mercer's cabin, soaked, shivering, and carrying a strip of blood-stained flannel in his teeth. Jack, a retired Navy SEAL who hadn't saved anyone in years, froze when he saw it. Someone out there was bleeding and still alive. Ranger whined, scratched the door, and looked up at Jack with the same desperate urgency Jack once saw in fallen teammates begging for help. Against the roar of the storm, Jack followed Ranger into the dark woods, and what he found at the bottom of a ravine would change 3 lives forever. A wrecked SUV, a dying young woman, and a missing child fighting to survive somewhere in the blizzard. Before this night was over, a broken soldier, a terrified boy, and a loyal dog would discover a bond stronger than fear and a new meaning of family. If you're listening right now, comment where you're from, or type Amen to everyone fighting their own storms tonight. The blizzard had been building over the Tetons since dusk, rolling in from the northwest like a living wall of white fury. By the time night fell across the Wyoming backcountry, the storm was no longer just weather. It was a force with teeth, grinding against the windows of Jack Mercer's cabin as if it wanted inside. Jack stood near the wood-burning stove, one calloused hand wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee. At 58, he looked like a man the mountains themselves had carved, tall and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw dusted with gray stubble, edges of his face sharp like chiseled stone. His skin was weather-worn from years under desert suns and ocean winds, etched with lines that came not from age but from battles. Some fought overseas as a Navy SEAL, others fought quietly alone in the silence of civilian life. His dark hair, streaked with silver, was kept short in a habit he had never broken. Jack lived alone not because he couldn't stand people, but because he no longer trusted himself around the fragile parts of the world. Losing his closest teammate during a mission 15 years ago had carved a hollow inside him that never quite sealed. He never talked about it, not even to Ranger, the 10-month-old German shepherd who now paced anxiously by the door. Ranger was striking in a way few dogs were, a large, powerful young shepherd with a thick sable and silver coat that shimmered even in dim lamplight. His ears were tall and alert, his eyes a deep amber full of intelligence. Jack had raised him since he was barely old enough to walk, rescuing him from a shelter after the dog's original owner abandoned an entire litter during a harsh winter. Ranger had grown into a disciplined, intuitive animal, part companion, part working dog, part shadow. Normally he stayed close to Jack's side, calm and focused. But tonight, something was wrong. The storm howled outside, a roar of icy wind slamming into the cabin walls, and Ranger kept pacing between the door and Jack, whining low in his throat. Jack watched him carefully, reading the tension in the dog's posture, the frantic flick of his tail. This wasn't fear. It was urgency. "What's gotten into you, boy?" Jack muttered, setting down his coffee. Ranger pawed the door, claws clicking sharply against the wood, then turned to Jack and barked, a sharp, demanding bark he almost never used. When Jack still didn't move, Ranger darted to the window, stood on his hind legs, and scratched at the glass, nose pressed to the swirling white outside. Jack frowned. Ranger had never behaved like this, not even during thunderstorms or when wild animals passed near the cabin. Something out there had dragged the dog into the heart of the blizzard, something he thought was more important than his own comfort or safety. Jack grabbed his coat from the hook by the stove, The leather was old but well kept, lined with heavy shearling that once belonged to his father. He pulled it over his red and navy flannel shirt, then reached for his boots, the thick-soled ones he used for heavy snow. Ranger suddenly froze. His body stiffened, ears swiveling toward the door. A second later, Jack heard it too, a faint scratching, barely audible under the storm's rage. It was light, inconsistent, desperate. Not an animal trying to get in. Something smaller. Something afraid. Jack yanked open the door, bracing his shoulder against the force of the wind. The blizzard punched into him, icy shards needling his face. Ranger pushed past him and onto the porch. That was when Jack saw it. A small shape huddled against the railing. Ranger, soaked and trembling, but not trying to get inside. The dog stood there staring at Jack with an intensity that made Jack's stomach tighten. Ranger barked once, then stepped forward, nudging something with his nose. Jack squinted through the blowing snow. A strip of red and black flannel hung from Ranger's collar, wedged under the buckle. It was torn, frayed, stiff with frozen blood. Not Ranger's blood. Jack stepped into the storm, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He knelt to inspect the fabric more closely, and a chill colder than the Wyoming wind ran down his back. It was the exact kind of flannel shirt worn by the locals, rugged mountain folk, loggers, guides, ranch families. People who lived far from town, just like him. People who knew these woods, respected these storms, and didn't make mistakes easily. If someone wearing that shirt had lost this much blood, they might still be out there, alive but running out of time. Ranger whined again, nudging Jack's errant arm, then turned toward the tree line. The dog's tail was low, his posture tense, his paws shifting restlessly in the snow. He was urging Jack forward, pleading for him to understand. Jack closed his eyes for a moment. Every instinct he had tried to bury, the instincts trained into him during years as a SEAL, rose again, clear and sharp. Someone needed help. And Ranger. Ranger had chosen Jack to find them. He stood, zipped his coat, tightened the straps of his boots, and reached inside the cabin for his flashlight and emergency pack. The beam of the light cut only a narrow tunnel through the swirling white, but it was enough. Jack stepped off the porch, Ranger at his heel. The wind howled louder, as if warning him not to go. Jack ignored it. He followed Ranger into the storm. 100 yards from the cabin, Jack paused. The trees ahead shifted in the blizzard like dark ghosts, their outlines bending in the violent wind. Ranger stopped too, looking back at Jack as if needing confirmation that the man was truly committed to this path. Jack gave a single nod. Ranger pressed forward, breaking trail through the drifts. Then, just as Jack lifted his foot for the next step, a distant sound sliced through the storm, faint yet unmistakable. A cry, not quite human, not quite animal, something caught between terror and pain. Jack froze, breath suspended. Ranger whipped his head toward the sound, muscles coiling, and somewhere out in the blinding white, something moved. The storm grew harsher the deeper Jack Mercer and Ranger moved into the forest, the wind now a constant scream threading between the pines. Ranger led with a sense of purpose Jack had never seen in him before. The young German shepherd's body was low, muscles taut under the thick silver and sable coat, his nose slicing through the icy air as he tracked something only he could smell. Jack, with his disciplined stride and quiet breath, scanned every shadow. Years of training had taught him to read the land like a map, and here, despite the blistering white chaos, he recognized clues. A broken twig still leaking sap, a smear of dark red against bark, the faint outline of a boot print already half buried by snow. Whoever Ranger had found earlier, they were moving. Or had been, and not in good shape. Jack kneeled by a patch of crimson snow and touched it with 2 fingers. It was already freezing into the crust. "Maybe an hour old," he muttered. Ranger circled back toward him, whining softly. Jack's flashlight cut through the snow, creating a narrow tunnel of light, and in that shifting corridor he saw it. The deep parallel trenches of tire tracks veering violently off the main path. They cut across the slope in jagged swerves before vanishing at the edge of the ridge like a sentence ending mid-thought. Jack felt the old familiar churn in his gut, the kind he used to get on missions just before discovering something he didn't want to see. He approached the cliff slowly, Ranger glued to his heel, the dog's breath pluming out in white bursts. Jack angled the flashlight downward, bracing himself for what lay below. The beam fell on the mangled underside of an SUV. The vehicle had flipped and landed between 2 massive fir trees, their thick trunks now cracked and leaning inward, as if cradling the wreck. Snow smothered the edges, already trying to swallow the scene whole. Jack's jaw tightened. He started down the slope, moving with controlled precision, testing each foothold. Ranger descended beside him, slipping once but recovering with instinctive agility. When they reached the overturned SUV, Jack immediately saw movement inside. A small, faint flicker, like a dying flame. He crouched by the shattered window and shone his light inside. A young woman sat pinned in the driver's seat, her upper body slumped forward against the deflated airbag. She looked barely in her 20s, with long chestnut hair matted with snow, blood, and shards of glass. Her face was pale, almost blue-tinged, but even through the shock, she had soft, refined features, the kind of delicate jawline and gentle brow that made her look younger than she was. Her coat was torn open at the shoulder, revealing the pattern Jack recognized immediately: red and black flannel. Emily Carter. Jack didn't yet know her name, but he knew that shirt, and he now knew exactly where the bloody scrap on Ranger had come from. He leaned in gently. "Ma'am, you hear, me?" His voice carried the calm authority of a man who had pulled wounded strangers out of worse places than this. Her eyelids fluttered, then lifted just enough for him to see eyes, hazel, warm, but clouded heavily by pain. She blinked slowly at Jack's rugged face, taking in his square jaw, the gray stubble, the icy streaks clinging to his eyebrows. Something in his presence seemed to ground her. Her lips trembled, forming a whisper that came out barely audible. "My brother." Jack steadied her shoulder with a careful hand. Her bones felt fragile under his touch. "Where is he?" Emily's breath hitched. She raised a trembling finger toward the shattered rear window, her hand shaking violently. "Mason." He crawled out. "The cold." She winced, tears rising in her eyes. Not from her own injuries, Jack realized, but from terror for the child. Jack looked to the back of the vehicle. The child's seat hung crooked, empty. Snow had blown into the cabin, layering the shattered glass with white dust. A set of small footprints, already fading, led away from the wreck. "How old is he?" Jack asked. "7," she breathed. "No coat." He was scared. "Jack," she stopped, coughing hard, her whole body trembling. Jack froze for half a second when she said his name, but then realized she wasn't addressing him. She was calling out for someone she thought was still near. Her consciousness was slipping between reality and desperation. Ranger pressed his head against Jack's arm, letting out a soft yelp. The dog had understood the urgency before Jack had even arrived. Now Jack saw it clearly. Emily clutched his wrist with surprising strength. "Find him," she whispered, eyes filling with pleading gravity. "Please, find my brother. Don't save me first." Jack felt something inside his chest crack. Not physically, but emotionally, in a place he had kept sealed for years. This was all too familiar. Kneeling beside a dying body. Fingers clutching at him, begging him to save someone else. The echo of a voice from long ago, another battlefield, another failure, rushed back with a coldness even the Wyoming storm couldn't match. For a moment, Jack wasn't in the snow. He was back in the desert, holding the bleeding form of a teammate who had whispered, "Save them. Forget me," as his pulse faded under Jack's hands. Jack closed his eyes briefly, fighting the surge of old memories. When he opened them, the resolve in his gaze was sharp enough to cut steel. "I'm going after him," he said quietly. Emily let out a shaky exhale, relief passing over her face like a fragile shadow of hope. Her hand slipped from Jack's wrist, falling limp against her lap. Jack checked her pulse. Not strong, but steady enough that she had time. Maybe minutes. Maybe a bit more. Ranger pawed at the snow, ready to move. Jack took one last look at the wreck, at Emily's pale face illuminated by his flashlight, then turned toward the dark tree line. "Ranger," he said firmly. "Track." The dog lowered his head, nose to the snow, and immediately found the fading scent trail. Jack took a single step into the growing darkness. And then, from somewhere far ahead, deep in the storm, something small cried out. Not the wind, not an animal, a child. Jack's heart surged, and Ranger bolted forward. Jack followed. The forest swallowed Jack Mercer and Ranger whole as they pressed deeper into the blizzard. The storm now a roaring wall that blurred trees into shifting ghosts. Ranger forged ahead with determination far beyond his 10 months of age. His thick sable and silver coat already crusted with ice, his breath forming quick white bursts that vanished instantly in the wind. Every few steps the dog paused, nose buried in the powder, analyzing scents the storm was trying to erase. Jack followed close behind, hunched against the cold, his heavy shearling coat snapping in the wind. His boots crunched through deep drifts as he tried to filter out the howling around him. He knew the boy's tracks wouldn't last long. They already resembled smudges more than footprints. A sharp gust whipped snow across his face like a sheet of needles. Jack gritted his teeth in silence. Years of Navy SEAL training had taught him to move where others froze, to think where others panicked. But even he felt the cold, sinking bone deep. His breath came out in harsh bursts of steam. Ranger suddenly stopped so abruptly that Jack nearly bumped into him. The dog's ears were pinned forward, his body stiff. Jack lowered his center of gravity, flashlight beam cutting through the blizzard, revealing a small hollow between two boulders. At first, it looked like nothing more than a dark crevice, but then Jack saw it. A small figure curled tightly against the stone wall. Mason Carter. The boy was tiny, even for 7, with a narrow frame wrapped in nothing but a thin sweatshirt and jeans. His hair, a soft brown like his sister's, was plastered to his forehead in frozen strands. His lips were purple, eyelids fluttering weakly, and his breath came in thin, stuttering puffs. Jack slid into the crevice, heart pounding with urgency. Mason, he said firmly, though his voice softened. I've got you. The boy didn't respond except for a faint twitch. Jack removed his coat in one swift motion, the cold stabbing his exposed arms immediately. He wrapped the thick shearling around Mason, pulling him close to his own chest. Skin contact, body heat transfer. He'd done this before on cold missions. Stay with me, kid, Jack whispered, adjusting his hold. Ranger planted himself at the mouth of the crevice, his large frame blocking the brunt of the wind. Snow collected along his back, and though he shivered, the dog didn't move an inch. He was a barrier, a guardian. Jack lifted Mason carefully, the boy's head resting against his shoulder. He could feel the frightening limpness of a body losing warmth. Mason was dangerously far along in hypothermia. As Jack climbed out of the crevice, the blizzard tried to shove him back, but he pushed forward through instinct and sheer will. The snow came up nearly to his knees now. Ranger stayed close, circling around Jack as if protecting both of them from invisible threats. Hang on, Mason, Jack murmured, tightening his grip. The boy made a faint sound, not quite a cry, not quite a breath, but it was enough to push Jack faster. He moved with the precision of a man who had carried wounded brothers through gunfire, each step powered by something deeper than strength. The return trip was brutal. The storm had worsened. Ranger barked as if urging Jack onward, his voice sharp against the storm's roar. The dog's amber eyes never left Jack's face, as though reading his every move. Finally, after an exhausting trek up the slope, Jack saw the dark silhouette of the wrecked SUV buried under snow and broken branches. Relief flickered through him, but only for a second. Mason needed warmth now. Real warmth. Jack crouched near the back of the vehicle, pushing aside the snow that had drifted into the cabin. The interior was cramped, crushed, but it was shelter. He eased Mason into the passenger footwell where the wind couldn't reach. Ranger climbed in beside the boy, curling his large body around Mason's legs to add more heat. Jack pulled emergency blankets from his pack, thin but reflective, and wrapped them around both child and dog. Then he ducked out long enough to grab pine branches to wedge across the broken window, reducing the wind that sliced into them. The temperature inside the wreck wasn't good, but it was no longer deadly. Jack pressed 2 fingers against Mason's neck again. The pulse was weak but present. "You're tough," Jack whispered. "You hang in there." For a brief moment, Jack let himself look toward the driver's seat. Emily Carter's body lay slumped, her chest barely rising. Her pale face was gentler in the dim lantern light Jack had placed on the console. She seemed peaceful in a haunting way, like someone halfway between 2 worlds. Jack touched her hand lightly, almost reverently. "I found him," he said, voice low. "He's here." Whether she heard him or not, he couldn't tell. Hours passed. Ranger didn't move from Mason's side, even when the boy stirred slightly and whimpered his sister's name. Jack monitored both injured siblings as the storm continued its merciless assault on the outside world. The night crawled by one agonizing minute at a time until, finally, a faint silver glow crept through the shattered windshield. Dawn. The storm was weakening, the howl softening into distant murmurs. Jack checked Mason first. The child's breathing was steadier. His color had improved slightly. Then Jack turned to Emily. Her chest no longer moved. Her face, framed by frozen strands of chestnut hair, was serene, almost smiling. She looked like someone who had held on just long enough to know the person she trusted had kept his promise. As Jack pulled his coat tighter, he whispered, "Rest easy, Emily." Ranger lifted his head and pressed his nose against Emily's fingers, letting out a soft, mournful whine. Mason, still asleep, shifted slightly and murmured something that sounded like "M." Jack took a long breath, steadying himself. The storm was ending. Help would come soon. They had survived the night. And then, from somewhere outside the wreck, far through the quiet morning air, a crunch of footsteps approached. Not the storm, not an animal. Someone was coming. The footsteps came closer through the thinning storm, crunching steadily over the frozen ground. Jack Mercer shifted his weight, ready for anything. Ranger stood rigid beside him, ears forward, body still except for the faint rise and fall of his breath as he watched the snowy outline approach. Then a familiar voice cut through the quiet morning air. "Jack, that you?" Deputy Hank Collins emerged from between the trees, snow plastered to the brim of his hat and the sleeves of his tan sheriff's jacket. Hank was in his mid-40s, a big man built like an oak stump, broad shoulders, thick neck, hands large enough to palm a basketball. His face was rough-hewn, with a full dark beard sprinkled with frost, and a scar across his left eyebrow from a bar fight in his youth. Despite his intimidating build, Hank's eyes were gentle, warm brown, with an earnestness that made people trust him. He had a reputation for being steady, loyal, and stubbornly moral, shaped by the years he spent caring for a bedridden mother before she passed. That responsibility had carved a permanent seriousness into him. Jack straightened. "Hank." Hank let out a breath of relief that fogged the air. "We saw the wreck from the ridge. Search and rescue's right behind me." He stepped closer and saw Mason curled in Jack's coat, Ranger shielding the boy. Hank's voice softened. "Kid's alive?" "Barely, but he'll make it," Jack said. "Where's your team?" 10 minutes out. Radio's been spotty." Hank crouched next to Mason, moving carefully so as not to startle him. "Poor kid." He reached a hand toward the boy's forehead. Mason's eyes suddenly flickered open. Disoriented, exhausted, his small body tensed. The moment he saw an unfamiliar face hovering above him, he panicked, letting out a sharp cry. He scrambled backward, gripping fistfuls of Jack's coat. Ranger stepped between Hank and Mason, with a deep growl vibrating in his chest, not threatening, but warning. Hank froze, hands raised. "Easy, boy. Easy." "It's all right, Ranger," Jack murmured, placing a calming hand on the dog's back. But Mason wasn't calming. Tears welled in his eyes. His breathing quickened, sharp and uneven. Hank recognized the signs and slowly backed off. Jack crouched closer to the boy. "Mason," he said softly, using a voice he hadn't used in years. Low, steady, reassuring. The boy looked up, eyes filled with fear until he caught sight of two things: Jack's flannel collar peeking out beneath his coat, and Ranger's amber gaze watching him with unwavering devotion. Mason reached for Ranger, burying his face in the dog's thick fur, sobbing quietly. "Look at me," Jack said gently. "You're safe." Mason clung to him now, trembling but calmer. When Jack lifted him into his arms, the boy wrapped both arms around Jack's neck without hesitation. Hank watched the scene unfold in silence, his expression shifting from professional concern to something deeper: recognition. "You've always had a way with the scared ones," Hank said quietly. Jack didn't answer. Instead, he carried Mason toward the area where the rescue team was arriving. Two paramedics, bundled heavy in dark jackets, hurried over. One was a tall, lean man with sharp cheekbones and sandy hair. The other, a short woman with freckles and blazing red hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. They introduced themselves quickly, Callum Price and Dana Brooks, voices steady despite the cold. They examined Mason, checked vitals, wrapped him in thermal blankets. Ranger hovered close, not letting either paramedic move without watching their every action. Hank placed a firm hand on Jack's shoulder. "There's something you need to see," he said. "Found it when I checked the driver." Jack's face tightened. "Emily." Hank reached into his coat pocket and handed Jack a small leather wallet. Faded, cracked edges, clearly well used. This was hers. Jack flipped it open. A photograph of Emily and Mason smiled back at him. Emily with long chestnut hair neatly braided, Mason losing his front tooth but beaming ear to ear. Tucked behind the photo was a small handwritten note on lined paper. The edges were wrinkled as though it had been folded and unfolded many times. Hank cleared his throat. "I didn't read it. Thought you should." Jack unfolded it carefully. "If anything ever happens to me, please let Mason stay with someone kind. Someone who won't make him feel alone. Anyone Ranger trusts. I trust." Jack stared at the handwriting for a long moment. The words felt heavier than the mountain snow. Ranger nudged his leg gently, sensing the shift in emotion. Meanwhile, the paramedics prepared Mason for transport. Donna approached Jack. "We're taking him to the hospital in Jackson. You can ride behind, but we'll need to contact Child Protective Services immediately. It's protocol, sir." Jack's jaw tightened slightly. He'd expected it. Mason clung harder at the mere mention of being taken away. Ranger bristled, stepping closer to Jack as though forming a barrier. Hank stepped forward. "Hold on, Dana." His voice carried the authority of a lawman who wasn't about to be ignored. "This man pulled the kid out of a death trap in the middle of a storm. He's not exactly a stranger." "It's not about that," Dana said carefully. "If there's no immediate guardian—" "There is," Hank interrupted firmly. "At least for now." Jack looked at the deputy, surprised. Hank's eyes were steady. "You saved my life once," Hank said, lowering his voice so only Jack could hear. "Pulled me out of that compound in Kandahar when no one else thought I made it. I owe you more than you know. And right now, that kid owes you his." Before Jack could respond, a new voice approached, low, official, and edged with bureaucratic caution. A woman in her late 30s stepped through the snow, bundled in a navy parka marked CPS. Her name badge read Lydia Grant. She had a sharp, angular face framed by dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Her eyes were an intense gray, analytical and assessing everything at once. She carried herself with rigid precision, the kind of posture born from years of following rules to the letter. "We need to determine temporary custody," Lydia said calmly. "The boy must go through proper placement." Ranger growled again, not aggressively, but protectively. Mason buried his face deeper into Jack's shoulder. Hank stepped between Lydia and the child. "With all due respect, Lydia, maybe read this first." He handed her Emily's note. She read it silently, lips pressed into a thin line. When she finally looked up, her expression wavered just slightly, not enough to betray emotion, but enough for Jack to notice the human beneath the rulebook. "It still must be reviewed," she said, but her voice had softened. "However, the note will be considered." Jack said nothing. He simply stood there with Mason in his arms, Ranger pressed against his side, and the storm finally dying around them. And then Lydia spoke again, quietly this time. We'll take this one step at a time. But for now, Mason stays with you until we reach town. Jack exhaled, a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Ranger finally relaxed. But before anyone could move, a distant radio crackled on Hank's belt, and the voice on the other end said something that made Hank's face drain of color. "Deputy Collins, we've got a situation. You all need to get back, now." The drive down the mountain felt longer than the night Jack Mercer had just survived. Snow still clung to the road, and the sun hovered pale behind the clouds, casting washed-out light over Wyoming's frozen wilderness. Mason sat bundled in thermal blankets in the back of the rescue truck, leaning against Jack's side as though afraid he might vanish if he blinked. Ranger lay curled at the boy's feet, his thick silver and sable fur brushing Mason's legs each time the vehicle hit a bump. Jack stayed silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew any words would crumble under the weight of what had happened. Deputy Hank Collins drove ahead in his patrol cruiser, updating dispatch through the radio. Lydia Grant followed behind in her CPS SUV, eyes constantly flicking from the road to the mirror where she could see Mason through the rear window. Her expression was rigid as always, but the slight tension in her jaw softened each time she saw the boy gripping Jack's sleeve. Lydia wasn't unkind, just shaped by a system that demanded caution first and trust later. When they reached Jackson Memorial Hospital, the chaos began. Nurses rushed out to take Mason, but Ranger refused to let anyone separate him from Jack or the boy. The 10-month-old German Shepherd, muscular, heavily built for his age, with eyes sharper than most grown dogs, stood planted like a wall. Only when Jack placed a calm hand on his back did Ranger finally relent enough to allow the staff to do their work. Doctors examined Mason and confirmed what Jack already suspected: severe hypothermia, bruising, exhaustion, but nothing permanently damaging. The boy had survived because of Jack's quick actions and Ranger's relentless vigilance. Still, when Mason woke fully and saw a nurse reaching for him, he cried out, terrified, disoriented, and reached desperately for Jack. Ranger barked, low but protective, forcing two nurses to step back in alarm. Lydia stepped in, raising her hands gently. "It's all right. Jack is right here." Her voice, normally firm and procedural, had a tremor of sympathy. She looked at the boy, then at Jack. "Until the review meeting, he stays under your temporary supervision. 30 days. She paused. "Make them count." Jack nodded, unsure whether to thank her or simply accept the responsibility that was already forming inside him like gravity. Those 30 days on the mountain became something unexpected. Quiet mornings warmed by the smell of coffee, small footsteps on hardwood floors, Ranger's tail thumping whenever Mason entered a room. Jack taught Mason how to stack firewood, how to identify animal tracks, how to carve his initials into a walking stick. Mason, in turn, taught Jack something he didn't know he'd lost: the soft gravity of being needed. Ranger watched over them both, sleeping at the foot of Mason's bed, nudging Jack awake whenever the boy had nightmares. Every few days, Lydia drove up the mountain to check on them. She arrived in her navy parka, hair neatly tied as always, clipboard tucked under one arm. At first she asked rigid questions, but over time the edges of her formality began to crumble, just slightly, each time she saw Mason smiling beside Jack or Ranger dropping a stick at her feet, demanding acknowledgement. Lydia had never been married, never had children, and she guarded her heart with the same discipline she applied to paperwork. But even she couldn't ignore the way Mason clung to Jack, as though his life depended on it. One afternoon, Lydia stepped out onto the porch after her visit and hesitated. Snow fell around her in slow, drifting flakes. She looked at Ranger, then at Jack. For what it's worth, Emily Carter's note carries weight in cases like this, she said quietly. Judges take it seriously, but more importantly, so do I. Then she left, her footsteps crunching through the snow, leaving a trail that the wind slowly erased. A year passed. Mason grew taller, stronger. His cheeks regained color, his laughter returned, and he learned to run through the pine groves with Ranger always a few strides behind him. Jack found himself talking more, about music, about the Navy, about the mountains he once considered his prison, but now saw as his refuge. The boy and the dog filled the cabin with life again, something that felt suspiciously like family. Then came the day in Jackson, inside a wooden-paneled courtroom filled with ranchers, teachers, retirees, and neighbors who had come to see how the case would unfold. Mason sat next to Jack, holding his hand with the quiet confidence of a boy who knew he was no longer alone. Ranger lay at their feet, chin resting on his paws, but his amber eyes scanned every person in the room. Judge Harold Whitmore presided over the hearing, a man in his early 60s, tall and stern, with silver hair swept back and a face lined from decades of decisions that weighed heavily on him. His voice was deep, calm, the kind that could quiet a room without raising volume. He looked over the documents, including Emily's handwritten note, Lydia's reports, and testimonies from Hank and the paramedics. "Mr. Mercer," the judge said at last, peering over his glasses, "you are not the boy's blood relative. You did not know him before the accident. And yet—" He glanced at Ranger, then at Mason. "The court sees something undeniable." Mason squeezed Jack's hand. Jack didn't look away. Judge Whitmore continued, "Emily Carter's letter indicates trust. Trust in whoever Ranger chooses. And based on testimony, observation, and the stability you have provided." He set the papers down. "The court grants full and permanent adoption of Mason Carter to Jack Mercer." A collective exhale filled the room. Mason launched into Jack's arms, sobbing with joy. Ranger barked once, sharp, bright, triumphant. Hank clapped Jack on the back. Lydia wiped her eyes discreetly. Later that afternoon, Jack and Mason walked together to the foot of the mountain where Emily Carter had been laid to rest. The air was crisp, the sky a soft winter blue. Ranger trotted beside them, tail swaying gently. Mason knelt beside the simple wooden cross, brushing snow away. "You don't have to worry anymore," he whispered. "I have a good family now." Jack placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "Let's go home, son." Ranger barked softly, as if agreeing. And together, the three of them turned toward the trail, toward the cabin waiting for them, toward the life they had built from the ashes of a storm.